Welcome to the Garden of Belonging, a podcast that explores how we can more fully belong to ourselves. I'm your host, Kim K. Gray, a writer, life coach, homeschooling mom, and fellow human on this journey. Here in the Garden of Belonging, all of us belongs. Here we tend to all those parts we've hidden in hopes of fitting in, bringing forth the beauty that is our fullest selves. Let us journey together to more compassion for who we truly are and more courage to be that person. Today, I'd like to share with you this conversation with Thaís Sky. Thaís is a truth-speaking, edge-dwelling, trauma-informed life coach and teacher whose multifarious approach to healing has transformed the lives of hundreds of women worldwide. She offers her thoughts weekly on a podcast called Reclaim, and for over a decade, Thaís has coached visionaries, seekers, and cycle breakers who are ready to reclaim their worthiness and take up greater space in the world through her one-on-one work, as well as her year-long signature program, Worthy Women Rise. Recently, she has started mentoring coaches who want to deepen their work responsibly. She holds a master's degree in clinical psychology and infuses psychoanalytic theories, social justice, family systems, and mindfulness practices into her approach to tending what she calls the worthiness wound. You can learn more about her at iamthaissky.com or find her at just about everywhere on social media at iamthaissky. This is a really fun conversation, and we really dug in deeply to this idea of sort of coaching and in therapy and like where the similarities and differences are. Of course, we talk about the worthiness wound and a lot also about relationships and what it looks like to heal in relationship, why we need relationships. I also just want to say that doing this interview was an exercise in taking a leap because Thaís is someone that I followed for a while on Instagram and have listened to her podcast. And at one point she posted on Instagram like, hey, I'm looking for a podcast to be on. And I decided to reach out, even though my podcast is like this tiny little new thing, and she may have not even known who I was. But I reached out and she said yes, and I am so grateful, and it was a really wonderful conversation. So I encourage you to take that leap too. You'll never know what will happen. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome, Thaís. Thank you for joining me in the Garden of Belonging.
I'm so happy to be here, Kim. It's so nice to see your face.
Yeah. So this season, I'm talking with folks about this theme of blooming bravely. And I wonder, when I say that, what comes to mind for you and how does that show up in your life?
Oh, I mean, I love that. First off, I love a good, what is it? Is that alliteration when you do the two first letters? Yeah. And like, I think we often think of blooming as effortless, right? I think that that's what I love most about that alliteration is that I think the perception is that to blossom, to be our true selves is kind of this effortless enterprise. And therefore there's something so wrong with you if blooming is not effortless. And I think what first comes to mind is like, yeah, that sounds apt. That sounds about right. That blooming is a brave endeavor and requires effort, maybe not to plants, but we don't know, right? Actually, now that I say that, we don't know what effort it takes for plants to bloom. So yeah, I think that sounds about right. It takes a special type of gumption for us to live our fully expressed, blossomed lives.
Yeah. As you were talking about like what is the effort that it takes for a plant to bloom, I was just thinking about all the pollination that has to occur to build a fruit, to bear that fruit, as I watch the bees on all of our like flowers outside.
Yes. And I recently learned that the metamorphosis that happens in the cocoon from a caterpillar to a butterfly is not just this like growth of form, but it's actually a complete destruction of form and creation of new form. Yeah, it's like the caterpillar becomes gummy, becomes like nothing, and then it forms into a butterfly. I think that is such a beautiful metaphor for the inner process, that we actually kind of have to be willing to completely crumble and fall apart to make space for a total new evolution of our being. And we don't all have to do it. I mean, I know people choose not to, and I don't think that I'm morally superior because I want to go gummy. But I think for those of us who are attracted to this idea of metamorphosis, I think we have to be willing to surrender the parts that aren't working. And that is a very brave process.
Yeah, totally. So what do you think supports us to have that courage to really bloom into our full selves?
My first thought was people, but I think that many would contradict me and say, well, it's actually people that prevent me from growing. You know, the people in our lives would rather us stay small. I think that that's kind of the relationships many of us have are with people who kind of want us to grow, but also want us to fulfill the relational contract of being who they think we are. So there is that truth, but I don't know. I don't think I could be where I'm at today, and I don't think I could grow alone. I think the self-help kind of mentality needs to die because I appreciate tremendously what it's saying, which is that we live and we die alone, and that our internal world is very much our own to take responsibility of, and that no one can do this work for us. And at the same time, I think we blossom and we grow through relationship. And I think particularly those of us who gravitate towards self-help, self-development, the brokenness that we are gravitating towards fixing will actually probably most likely be fixed within a relationship, not outside of a relationship. And that can be terrifying. I mean, that's terrifying for those of us who never really have relationships where we feel fully supported and safe and seen. And yet I can't have any other answer, Kim. It's like people support our growth, and finding the right people to support our growth is one of the most important cornerstones of our development.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. And I think there's a real vulnerability that has to occur when we show up into those relationships and find the ones that are going to really be supportive, because we have to be able to have the courage to show up fully.
That's right.
And
That's
be
right.
seen.
That's right. Yeah, I remember doing this exercise in grad school with a colleague where we were supposed to ask for what we needed, and I asked them to look at me in deeply and to see me, and they did that. They practiced that, and I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle it. I was like, okay, this is enough.
Maybe I don't need that.
I don't need relationship, actually. But it is terrifying. We are terrified of being abandoned, of rejection, of loss, and I think we are also very terrified of being supported, of being held, of being seen, of being contained. I think it's very hard when we don't have an inner template of that to then have that. It's very confronting, and I think it really requires us to slowly expand our capacity, and that's very difficult work, but very gratifying when we do it, because relationships can actually be tremendously nourishing and healing. But it won't come in, and it's not in and of itself. We have to work towards that.
Yeah. So what do you think supports us to build and foster and find those relationships?
I think the typical conversation would take us to conversations about needs and boundaries. I mean, I think that that's an important conversation. It's prolific in the industry, particularly right now for some reason. Although I'm sure there are reasons that we can think about together culturally, politically, but there's a lot of conversations happening right now about needs, advocating for your needs, stating your needs. I love those conversations. I love talking about needs, and then boundaries. So because those have been talked about so amply, I think the direction I want to go towards is the more that we can reconcile and recognize the ways in which we push people away, the greater the likelihood that we'll be able to take people in. It requires a certain amount of kind of fortitude, internal strength to be able to be in a healthy relationship, because there has to be a certain amount of allowing the other person to be an other person. You know, my professor said to me the other day, and I've been talking about it in almost every single corner of my universe because I'm so obsessed with it. Like, can you trust someone you can't control? I mean, what type of question is that? The very, very cornerstone of trust, right, is to not be in control. But I think we often find that where we feel quote unquote safe, the relationships that we feel quote unquote safe in are the relationships we feel like we can control, the ones that we can manipulate, the ones that we've kind of contorted ourselves, people pleased ourselves into relationshiping. But that's not actual relationshiping, because relationship requires the other to be an other. So the question is, how can I cultivate a sense of safety in relationships I can't control? You know, how do we create safety when we've been taught that the ways in which we create safety is actually a way in which we try to control another?
Yeah. There's a sense of like wanting a predictability, I guess, to feel safe. You know, and I run up against that, just not even in relationships, but just for myself, is this idea that like the way I feel safe is to have control and predictability. But in fact, like life is not like that. And as you're saying, relationships, like healthy relationships aren't like that, because we need to allow the other person to be responsible for themselves, and we need to allow the world to change around us and us to change within it.
Well, that's exactly right. And you're speaking so perfectly to this conundrum, which is, in order for us to feel safe in relationship, the predictability is actually then leading us to relate to who we think the other is, and not actually who the other is. And then we fall into dangerous spaces of believing that the other needs to be a certain way in order for us to be safe. Now, I use the word safe because I think it's very normalized now, but I'm always weary of using the word safe, because I think it can be very weaponized. If you don't make me feel safe, that's on you, not on me.
Yeah.
And then it can very easily lead to conversations about abuse and trauma. And I think we need to be very linguistically aware that if we start to use definitions that are way beyond what the word means, then the word starts losing its value. So when we think about safe, you know, there is a certain amount of emotional safety, physical safety, relational safety that's required for any relationshiping. If you're in a relationship with someone that you don't know if they're going to physically hit you, you're not safe. If they're verbally abusing you, you're not safe. That is a fact. But how about we move into more nuance of, like, the person will never physically abuse you. They will never, you know, name call you. And yet we have this sense that we're not safe. That's where I'm curious about, is like, what is that? Why don't we feel safe in relationships that haven't shown any evidence that we are not in danger? And then that becomes an internal conversation rather than needing to remove yourself from the relationship type conversation. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, I'm just like, I'm seeping it all in, letting it all seep in, because there's a lot of some powerful questions and thoughts there. Well, I think that ties into your work about the worthiness wound. So that comes up there of like, how do I feel worthy in this and safe?
Because the worthiness wound, right, which I've dubbed this kind of phenomenon that happens inside of us, where we feel broken, inadequate, too much, not enough. The worthiness wound, I've kind of conceptualized it as a relational wound. It means that we're not born unworthy.
Mm-hmm.
don't believe. I really don't think babies come into this planet thinking I'm inadequate, I'm unworthy, I'm insignificant. I think it's becomes an imprint in us through the ways in which our caregivers and the world relates to us. And if we feel emotionally held, if we feel like our caregivers are curious about our internal state, if they can tolerate us being angry with them without punishing us, if they can kind of hold us in their minds without being destroyed meaning turning away, meaning me yelling as a 5-year-old, I'm angry at you, and mom, yelling back at me or turning away, punishing me, something like that, right? The more that we are in a caregiving dynamic where our parents are modeling to us that they can tolerate our internal state, we learn to tolerate our internal state. We learn, oh, my feelings are this, and we learn the language of our internal world. But more often than not, through subtle and not ill-intentioned ways, it's not about
Right.
ill intention. Through subtle ways, we often get the message that our internal state pushes away the other. It's too much for the other. Don't feel like that. Don't do that. Don't be like this. Don't say this. Don't do that. And they say that through words or through action. And so we start to learn through the relationship that our internal world is too much or not enough. That's the imprint of the worthiness wound. That's that kind of sense of who I am is not okay. And so if we're seeing the worthiness wound as a relational wound, as a modeling from our caregivers, Kim, then how do we heal it? It's not going to happen by reading or affirming a mantra that we are enough. It's
Mm-hmm.
just not going to happen through books. It can help our intellect, it can help us understand, but ultimately the experience needs to be in a relational dynamic where someone is helping you make sense of your internal world and they don't turn away. And through that very carefully curated kind of experience, that corrective type of experience, we start to learn, oh, actually, I've never been too much or not enough. Right? I'm actually full and whole and complicated, messy, imperfect human, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with me.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as some of the actions or behaviors that come from the worthiness wound?
The biggest ones that I work with my clients, these are certainly not all, but the biggest ones are people pleasing, perfectionism, and this perpetual comparitis, right? Comparing ourselves to others. Those are like the three big ones, but they're not the only ones. Sabotaging ourselves in relationship, continually being in relationships with people who aren't emotionally available. I mean, there's so many different ways that it can manifest, but I often work with those whose worthiness wound manifests through people pleasing, right? People pleasing is inherently a protective way in which we learn how to orient ourselves towards the other person rather than orient towards our own sense of self. So we develop a sense of self through the lens of an other. So why do we do that? Because we think that there's something that's so wrong with us that if we don't do that, then we'll be lost, damaged, punished, abandoned. Perfectionism is another self-protective behavioral set of traits that make us that it comes from this idea that if we can be perfect, we'll be loved. And then comparitis is a big one where there's this chronic sense that somebody else will give us permission to be ourselves. If we could just see ourselves in somebody else through their perfect, wonderful, beautiful lives, then we'll be able to finally see ourselves in our lives. So those are some of the ones that I tend to work with the most because they most resemble my own manifestations of the worthiness. But of course, there's so many others, and we each have to find that ourselves, how it manifests for us, and think about what is driving this core sense of feeling inadequate. What do we notice ourselves doing as a result of that core sense of brokenness?
And do you see the worthiness wound as something that we can like heal or break free of, or is it something that is sort of we learn to live with?
I think like a combination of all that. I
Okay.
think I often use the language of like heal the worthiness wound because it's easy. It's easy, palatable language to understand. I think it's very tantalizing of a gift. Like, oh, if I could just do this, that Thais is promising me, like I won't ever feel inadequate again. I use that language very thoughtfully though, knowing that there is no gift, that there is nothing I could 5 steps that I could give anybody that would heal the worthiness wound. I do think that there is management of it. I do think that there is tending of it. And I do think there are ways to make it smaller. But I mean, Ken, let's think about like the world that we live in, let's think about systems of oppression. Let's think about the injustices of this world, like just the general unfairness of being human. We can think about the eco-genocide. We can think, I mean, there's so many different ways in which we're seeing the world's worthiness wound, where we're seeing the ways in which systems, society, cultures perpetuating the narrative of inadequacy and not enough. We see it through capitalism and consumerism. I mean, so if we live in a world that's so baked in, kind of oppressive ways of interacting and being together, can one individual ever not carry this? I don't know. I think that's a big weighty task. It's kind of like asking for the person to take on the weight of the world. So I think on that level, I don't know if we can ever think there needs to be some really heavy system changes. And I don't know if that will ever happen. So I think in the world that we live in, we're always going to have a level of believing we're inadequate, not enough. I don't know if it has to be so big in our lives. And I don't think it has to be so paralyzing, overwhelming, demoralizing, spiraling, painful as it can often feel. I don't think that it has to be that way forever. So in that way, I do see hope in this work.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think about how the word come back comes to mind, but I feel like that's just a little aggressive, but to heal that wound while we're in these systems that perpetuate it, right? Like, how do we work within that?
I mean, it's this delicate balance of, we both have personal power and we're victims of, right? Like, just because we live in systems of oppression doesn't mean that we have to kind of that we don't have any say, we don't have any power, we don't have any capacity. We each as individuals do have responsibility for our measure of it, our part in it. So there is a level of personal power that we all have, and then we are all victims. I say we are all, I mean those of us who carry marginalized identities. The more marginalized an identity, the more we're navigating systemic oppression, right? So but that would feel foolish for me to say that somebody who carries multiple identities that are marginalized in our world are now doomed and gloomed to carry a worthiness wound forever. I don't see it that way. So it's a delicate balance of systemic oppression is a thing. It affects us. It imprints beliefs into us, and we have power in how we navigate it. We have decisions that we make. We have ways that we can address and tend to ourselves so that we don't participate in these systems, so that we unlock our own kind of revolutionary power of potential within us, so we got to navigate these two things very carefully, because we don't want to victim blame, and we also don't want to make it sound like we don't have any ability to navigate these things.
Yeah. I think it kind of comes back to what you were saying about healing in relationship, because if we can build relationships with people who understand the world in the same way and like don't reflect some of those systems of oppression back onto us, that maybe we get a little bit more, we feel a little more supported because there's more, like our ideas are reflected in others.
Sure. Absolutely. And when I say, healing in relationships, I think there are specific relationships that we can heal ourselves in, not all relationships.
Right.
Um, and now we're starting to get into this idea of like getting professional support, working with a coach, a therapist to heal, whatever language resonates, the work resonates. But we, if the danger of not getting any type of professional support is that we will probably just perpetuate what we know.
Mm-hmm.
And so having someone who can see us from a different lens and can help us see our own baloney, right? Like our own stuffs, then that can help us break the patterns. That's kind of what I mean about healing in relationships. It can be a tantalizing and terrifying idea that any relationship can be healing. I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Well, that puts a lot of pressure or
Exactly.
the idea of responsibility onto that relationship.
That's right. And that can be a really big pressure and responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's another way that we could then be like taking the responsibility off of ourselves and putting it on someone else. Like, you're going to help fix me.
Yes. And we do this all the time. I mean, I think the desire that other people that a healthy relationship, we'll just stumble upon a healthy relationship, right? And in the meantime, we're stumbling upon really shitty relationships, and it's because of the other person. The other person is the crappy person, right? And we just need to remove all the toxic, quote unquote, people in our lives. And then eventually we'll just find the healthy ones, like they're fruits on a tree, discard the crappy ones, the broken ones, and eventually you'll come upon the ripe oranges, and boom, you're in these thriving, healthy relationships. And like, the bad news is that is literally not how it works.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is that's literally not how it works.
Right.
I don't like to use the word toxic because I don't even know what that means. And I think it perpetuates this idea of like disposability. And if we dispose of all of our relationships, we're probably going to be disposed, right? I mean, let's be honest, if we view people as discard, like we can just discard relationships without showing up in them, then who's going to be there for us? And then we're just going to be left alone. Thriving, healthy relationship takes effort of both parties. That means that we have to see where we are, quote unquote, where we're bringing the painful patterns and dynamics, where we're hoping that the other person will be able to save us, that if they could be different, then we would be happy. Yeah. Not sexy work. Again, blooming bravely, man. It requires bravery to really commit to healthy relating.
Yep. So you started to talk a little bit about getting professional support.
Yeah.
And you're a coach and also have gone back and now have your master's in clinical psychology, right?
That's right.
So what do you see as like the commonalities and differences in those two areas, coaching and psychotherapy?
Yeah. I mean, they are both extremely different and extremely similar. I think both industries want to pretend that they're very different because it benefits them to see it very different. And I think it's actually quite scary how similar it is and how irresponsible that is. I went back to school and got my master's because I was doing deep emotional work with my clients and started to feel like maybe there was a level of irresponsibility in it. And like it was my own experience. I'm not saying that all coaches are irresponsible if they're doing deep emotional work. It's just, for me, I wanted more tools. I was reaching the edges of my limitations and wanted to do more education. I wanted to learn more. And so I went back, got my master's, and realized, oh my gosh, there is this whole field a whole different way of seeing people and working with people that is quite exciting and thrilling. And I've been very, very blessed to find a lot of really cool people that see the world in a way that feels very expansive for me, and has taught me how to deepen my work. So the goal has been achieved. Yay. But the challenges are that the world of mental health is seen as an extension of the medical industry. It's seen as, well, just as you could have diabetes, you could have a mental illness, right?
Mhm.
It's seen as all kind of mental disorders are a consequence of some physiological issue. And this hasn't always been the case, but this is where the mental health field is gravitating more and more towards. So you go to therapy because you have a mental illness, you fix your mental illness, and then you are better, right? Anxiety is a illness, it's a problem. You need to go get it fixed by a professional, just like you would if you have a physical issue. This is like totally different language than the world of coaching. You know, coaches don't use this language. They don't understand things that way. They may use words like depression and anxiety, but they don't see anything medical about it. The coaching world is all about kind of marketing and this idea of self-development, self-improvement. And so both industries sees themselves as very different. But the truth is, if we strip away the medical model of the mental health world, most clinicians, psychotherapists are attempting to understand the nature of human suffering. Yes, I mean, that's the core of it. And I would say that that's the core of what coaches do too. The how of the getting there can feel very different, and also can feel very similar. I don't see much difference between mindset coaching and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the same stuff. It's just packaged and marketed, I think, different. I don't know if I'm answering your question at all. It's like I'm so in the weeds of it right now, Kim, that like I both have clarity in it, but I also sometimes have a hard time giving the 30,000 feet view of it because I'm so immersed in it. But therapists don't really respect life coaches, don't really sees life coaching as irresponsible and as a threat to their work. And life coaches kind of don't see themselves doing anything mental health related, so they don't see other therapy as a threat to their work. And I think that that's also really, really interesting.
Yeah. And I know, like, I see some mental health professionals adding coaching. I guess I see both things. I see coaches like you going and getting mental health education.
Yeah.
And then I also see mental health professionals going into coaching. But yeah, I see where there's a lot of kind of overlap. But what do you think about there's a big difference in training?
Yes.
For sure.
I think there's many reasons why a therapist would become a coach. You know, the coaching field is unregulated. So you don't have to follow any rules, and there's laws and ethics that you have to abide by to be a licensed psychotherapist. And that's nice. Like, you know, even though everything's virtual right now with the pandemic, I am not legally allowed to work with someone outside of the state of California as a psychotherapist.
Yeah.
Period. If I have a client that I've been working with for 10 years, let's say, and she decides that she wants to live 6 months in Florida, legally, I'm not allowed to work with her. There are some things that are changing, some states that allow this like temporary period of time, you know, and like, who's going to really know, right? So there's some that type of stuff going, but the law says that your licensure ends at the border. There was even a question on my law and ethics exam that said, if you're on a phone with your client, you're on the phone with your client having a phone session, and they tell you that in 20 minutes they're crossing the border into Nevada, what do you do? And the right answer is you tell them that in 20 minutes you have to stop the session.
Yeah.
So therapists don't want to work by that rule, right? They want to be able to work with anybody in the country or in the world. And so they, then coaching is the answer in a way.
Yeah.
And then sure, there's many therapists who want to work with, they don't want to do the deeper kind of work. They want to work more high level with people, and I to each their own, whatever they want to do. I'm the opposite. I want to go deeper. I want to do deeper work with people. I want to do substantive, long-term, meaningful work with people. And the coaching world, I've done that in the coaching world, but it's not the norm.
Yeah.
Right? The norm in the coaching world is short-term, high level, kind of quick quote unquote results. So I'm shadowing both worlds. It's a little confusing, a little disorienting. Nobody really gets it. I don't even really get it. I'm just trying to figure it out day by day. It is confusing. And at the same time, I think the proliferation of life coaching happened as a consequence to the fact that it oftentimes feels that therapy is inaccessible. And so part of what I feel like is eventually going to be my mission is to guide people to understand that it can actually be more accessible than people think.
Yeah. Well, and there can be the stigma too of like, well, I can only go to a therapist if something's wrong with me, quote,
Sure.
right?
Right.
Right. I'm struggling with like depression and anxiety or, whatever, some sort of diagnosable mental illness.
Exactly. Yeah. Like if I want, like, let's say my mother and I keep getting into a fight, I would then probably feel more tempted to get a book about the mother wound and look for a coach that does mother wound work, for example. And I would maybe look for a therapist because I don't have a mental illness. Like I don't have what I consider anxiety or depression. I just am struggling with my mother.
Mm-hmm.
So why would I go to a therapist? And I think that that's the way in which the coaching industry has stood out, right? It's like you have a very specific problem. I have a specific solution. And I can understand that. Like it's easier to then find someone who is specific about mother wound. You don't see that in the in the therapy industry. You don't really see anyone say like, I work with, people who struggle with the relationship with their mothers. It's not as marketable of a niche in the world of mental health.
Yeah. Well, and are you like, can you niche in that way, or do you need to be available because of insurance or like guidelines and things
you
about?
you could. Yes. It's not the norm.
Yeah.
But you certainly could. And you don't, if you want to be on an insurance panel as a psychotherapist and take on clients through insurance panels, then sure, you would also need to be specific around your mental illness repertoire of things that you'd work on. But in terms of like, if you're in private practice and you're marketing your work, I mean, sure, there's plenty of therapists who market themselves as like prenatal, postnatal care for the mother, for example. That's a very specific niche. And that's not, I guess you could call, postpartum depression a mental illness, I guess, if we're using that language, but not necessarily, right?
Yeah.
But you're right, Kim. You're really right that I think therapists tend to niche themselves around mental health diagnoses and not like challenges that people experience. And so that feels then inaccessible to people who are looking to actually fix the specific problems in their lives. So the mental health industry perpetuates itself that you can only go to therapy if you have a anxiety, depression, something along those lines. And so the coaching industry kind of makes billions of dollars unregulated with a lot of, sketchy people.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there's a real variation in what training you can have
Yes. What does certification mean? I mean, anyone can create a certification program and then market it, and then everyone has that certification, and it means nothing in terms of their ability to actually do work. Confusing. Both industries have its pros and have its cons, and both industries um, um, has work to do to be more accessible, ethical, et cetera, et cetera. But I love both industries. I love the coaching world. I think it's very I've seen wonderful coaches do wonderful work. I have a mentorship where I have both one-on-one mentees, and I also have a mastermind. And it's so cool to listen to these really ethical coaches grappling with the complications of doing this work and doing it really thoughtfully. It's like, it gives me so much hope that there's really good stuff happening in the coaching industry. So I don't think that it has to go away or that it's bad or wrong or broken, but I do wish that there was more thoughtfulness of more responsibility. I think life coaches or coaches in general think that they're not operating with people's mental health. But the truth is, you are doing mental health work. It may not be illness, disorder, diagnosis, it may not be that language, but you are working with people's mental health, and therefore you have a responsibility to do ethical work. And I think we're all struggling with what ethicability, kind of looks like, but I don't think that there's a norm in the industry to get supervision, to get support around your actual coaching. It's all about building a business, you know what I mean? And that's something that comes out of the world of psychotherapy that I think is so powerful. This understanding of consultation, supervision, group support, reaching out to your colleagues for help around a specific client, that type of norm that's in the therapy world, I wish was more of a norm in the world of coaching.
Yeah. But I see people like you, creating these programs for coaches that can foster some of that. I think I've seen a couple other people doing something similar.
I agree. It's getting there. It's happening too slowly though. and also I think a lot of coaches think, oh, that's on that. Like, I'm doing good. I don't need this, right?
Right.
They need this, not me. Oh, other coaches need this. This is a great thing, Thais, for those people, but not for me. And I think what's important is for us to model, actually, me too. I've been in the world of coaching for 10 years, and I get supervision, like I get support around my clients, not because I am not good at what I do, I'm incompetent, but that I really care and I have blind spots, and I often miss what's happening, and having someone to talk about it with can be so. This is how we fine tune our skills, not just in getting more and more classes, like we fine tune it by bringing our knowledge right to the work.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. It's a good.
I mean, you're helping me as I'm talking about it, so I'm making sense of it in my mind. So I appreciate the questions and this dialogue. I'm certainly not the end all authority. I just am a person with a lot of opinions. And it's, it's a way too that there's this bias, what is it called, where we think we know more than we do. And I think it's really, really important for us to stay learning, stay in this kind of mindset of continual learning and growing, because we actually know very little.
Yeah, and
that's
knowing
a good thing.
And being shown our blind spots, for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
And that's the same when we talked about healing in relationships, right? I mean, this is just an extension of that, just for a specific career. But if we heal within professional relationships that are relational, and that we can grapple with what it means to be in a relationship and what it means to do our own inner stuff with somebody, then the same could be said about the power of mentorship, supervision, whatever we call it, which is that we heal our worthiness wound, our inadequacies, our fears of being a bad coach, being wrong, being whatever. We tend to that in relationship with someone whose whole job in that moment is to help you make sense of what's happening in your work.
Yeah. Very valuable. For sure.
Yeah.
So if you had one tip for my listeners
What tip?
about how to bloom more bravely, what would it be? Like where should they start?
The phrase that came to my mind right now, and I'm just gonna kind of riff on it, is just this idea of like root where you're planted, this idea of like bloom where you're rooted. What is the phrase?
Yeah, it's escaping me as well.
Bloom where you're planted sounds great. So we're just gonna go with that. I don't know if that's the right one, but it's this idea of like there will always be sometime the grass is always greener, right? There's always the future, which is better than the present in our minds and our fantasies. And I think there's something really powerful about letting yourself be fully rooted here, like really own what is we don't have to look for a healing elsewhere. We are already where the healing can take place in the most powerful, potent way. So the tip, I guess, would be you don't have to do anything more than look at where you are. If you're like, where do I start, Thais, in like healing the worthiness wound? Well, where does your inadequacy come up the most for you? That's where you start. Like, okay, you heal in relationships, Thais, but like how, what relationship do you choose? Or, where do I start? And it's like, well, what relationship are you struggling with the most? And what are you struggling with the most in that relationship? Right there is a perfect place to start. Wherever we are, the perfect combination of healing and brokenness is, you don't have to go do some special retreat somewhere to tend to what is here. So root, really look at and examine the places that don't feel good. The fear is that we're spreading negativity if we focus on negativity, but actually if you don't look at what's not working, it's not going to continue to then it's not going to suddenly work.
Yeah, it won't go away just painting it gold.
Wish it would, because gold is great and pretty, but right, it's like putting whipped cream on poop. It can hide the poop a little bit, but eventually that whipped cream's going to melt and you're going to be left with the shit. It's like, or another metaphor that we're using because of plants right now is like weeding, right? Like if you're weeding a garden, like you have to actually get it by the roots. You can't just snip off the top and expect the weed to go away. And I think that that's what positive thinking tends to lead us into doing. But get to the root, get support, get help, don't do it alone, and examine where you are and allow your life to bloom.
I love that. Yeah. So I'm curious if like anyone's work stands out to you in this moment, in this area of supporting people to bloom bravely, that you would want to give a shout out to.
There's some really wonderful people out there doing incredible work. I mean, okay, here she is. Okay, so I'm a big fan of a woman out there named Mara Glatzel. She is just a phenomenal human, and I adore her. And she has a background in social work and a master's in social work, and does really incredible coaching. And I just admire her so much. I wanted to look up her handle, and her handle is in fact her name. So it's Mara Glatzel. Follow her on Instagram. I'm always a fan of getting people to that 10K follower number, because then you get the swipe up feature and all good things happen on Instagram when you get to that 10K. So go follow her, help her get to that 10K. I couldn't think of a human who's more deserving of it.
Yeah, she's wonderful. And she has a podcast.
She does have a podcast,
Needy, which is wonderful.
Which is wonderful. I've had her on my podcast. I mean, she's just one of those humans that's like such a hidden gem. And it's like, what? I don't understand Instagram following. I don't get how some people have like such a mediocre, if I could say that, presence online, and they have like hundreds of thousands of followers. And then some people, it just doesn't make sense to me how the thing works. But like Mara's one of those humans that's like, everyone can benefit from.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Thais, thank you so much for taking this time to chat with me today.
Thanks for having me, for having this conversation with me. These are all complicated subjects. There's no easy solutions, but I'm here to be in the murky waters with people and figuring it out together. You know, we don't have to do it alone.
Yeah, I think that's a good reminder that has been coming up throughout our conversation is you don't have to do it alone.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you for joining me in the Garden of Belonging. I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend your precious time with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and tell friends about it. Your efforts support me in reaching more people. Be sure to also check the show notes for ways to connect further with me and my guests. Until next time, I'm wishing you trust in your inherent belonging.